Look around you. The legal frameworks that govern your society, the architecture of your civic buildings, the roots of the language you speak, and the very concept of an organized, globalized civilization. They all echo from a ghost that died over 15 centuries ago. Rome. It started as a cluster of thatched huts, perched on malaria-infested hills by the muddy banks of the Tiber River, a collection of outcasts, shepherds, and refugees bound together by little more than a fierce, unyielding refusal to bow. Yet, from these humble and violent beginnings, this small Italian town would grow into an absolute titan, conquering the known world, redefining human capability, and leaving a legacy so profound that even today, we live in its shadow. But how does a city of mud and blood rise to conquer the Mediterranean, only to implode under the weight of its own unprecedented success? To understand the full story of Rome is to witness the ultimate human drama, a masterclass in strategy, ambition, psychological warfare, and self-destruction. The story begins in the mists of legend, in the year 753 before the Common Era, born from fratricide and divine blood. According to myth, twin brothers Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, fought over where to build their new home. When Remus mocked the low defensive walls of his brother's chosen settlement by leaping across them, Romulus struck him down in a fit of rage, sealing the city's destiny in blood with the famous declaration, "So perish every one that shall leap over my walls." Romulus populated his fledgling city by offering sanctuary to outlaws, runaway slaves, and exiles from across the peninsula. Rome was a city born of the desperate and the dangerous, forged with a unique sociological advantage. It integrated the outsiders, instead of enslaving them, turning refugees into Roman citizens and soldiers. For its first 2 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, a time of fierce expansion and cultural borrowing from the neighboring Etruscans and Greeks. But the Romans possessed a visceral, culturally ingrained hatred of absolute monarchy. When the last king, Tarquin the Proud, a tyrant of unimaginable cruelty, pushed the populace too far, the aristocracy snapped. In 509 BC, led by figures like Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans expelled the monarchy forever, swearing a sacred oath, never again, to let a single man wear the crown. They established the Republic, a complex, fragile experiment in shared power, governed by elected magistrates, a senate of elite elders, and popular assemblies. It was not a democracy in the modern sense, but an oligarchy balanced by fierce internal checks and balances, designed to prevent tyranny while unleashing the collective will of the state. Yet, survival in the ancient Mediterranean was a zero-sum game. Surrounded by hostile tribes, the Samnites, the Etruscans, the fierce hill-dwellers of central Italy, Rome realized early on that defense meant perpetual offense. If you did not conquer your neighbor would annihilate you. The Roman military machine was born from this existential dread. Unlike other ancient powers that relied on mercenary armies, Rome fielded a citizen militia, farmers who picked up swords to defend their lands and returned to the plow when the harvest called. But the Romans revolutionized warfare. They replaced the rigid, unwieldy Greek phalanx with a manipular legion, a flexible, modular formation of independent blocks of heavily armored infantry capable of adapting to chaotic terrain, outmaneuvering enemies, and punching through enemy lines with brutal efficiency. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had secured the Italian peninsula, but this regional victory placed them on a direct collision course with the undisputed superpower of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. A Phoenician merchant empire sprawling across North Africa, Spain, and the islands, Carthage possessed immense wealth, an unrivaled navy, and control of global trade. What followed was a series of titanic struggles known as the Punic Wars, conflicts of epic scale that would test the absolute limits of human endurance. In the Second Punic War, Carthage unleashed the greatest tactical mind of antiquity, Hannibal Barca. Driven by a lifelong oath of vengeance sworn to his father, Hannibal engineered one of the most audacious military moves in history. He gathered an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and a detachment of war elephants, marched them across the Iberian Peninsula, crossed the raging Rhone River, and scaled the snow-capped, treacherous peaks of the Alps to descend directly upon the Italian heartland. The elements, hostile mountain tribes, and freezing temperatures decimated his army. but Hannibal achieved the impossible element of surprise. For 16 years, Hannibal played a deadly game of cat and mouse across Italy, annihilating Roman armies in traps of stunning psychological genius. At the Battle of Cannae, in 216 BC, Hannibal executed the most famous double envelopment in military history, slaughtering nearly 70,000 Romans in a single afternoon, the worst single-day defeat in Roman history. By all laws of war and logic, Rome should have sued for peace. Any other civilization would have collapsed. But Rome possessed a terrifying, almost fanatical resilience. They refused to surrender. They simply raised new legions, dug deeper into their human reservoir, and eventually adopted a strategy of attrition under Fabius Maximus, avoiding direct confrontation while bleeding Hannibal dry. Realizing he could not defeat Rome in Italy, while Rome still controlled the seas, the Senate made a brilliant strategic gamble. They sent a young, ambitious general named Publius Cornelius Scipio to attack Carthage's home base in Spain, and eventually to cross over into North Africa itself. Panicked, Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy. At the Battle of Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio met Hannibal on the plains of North Africa, and decisively defeated him using Hannibal's own tactics against him. Carthage was broken. Rome burned the city to the ground, sowed its fields with salt, and annexed the western Mediterranean. The victory transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into an undisputed imperial superpower. Yet, conquering the world proved easier than managing the spoils. The influx of unimaginable wealth, millions of enslaved people, and vast tracts of conquered land began to rot the internal fabric of the Roman Republic. The traditional Roman farmer-soldier returned from decades of campaigning abroad, only to find his farm ruined, bought out by wealthy patricians who built massive slave plantation estates called times latifundia. A massive wealth gap tore society apart. The poor flooded into the city of Rome, forming a destitute, angry proletariat, while the senatorial elite grew obscenely rich and deeply corrupt. The social contract of the Republic began to fracture. Reformers like the Gracchi brothers attempted to redistribute land to the poor, but the conservative Senate brutally murdered them in the streets, introducing political violence as a legitimate tool of statecraft. The precedent was set. Soon, ambitious generals realized that their soldiers' loyalty lay not with the distant, corrupt Senate, but with the charismatic commanders who paid their wages and led them to glory. The warlords arrived. Marius and Sulla politicized the legions, turning them into private armies. Sulla marched his own Roman legions times against times the city of Rome itself, staging a bloody civil war and declaring himself dictator. The Republic was dying, and everyone could smell the blood in the water. Out of this chaos emerged history's most iconic personality, Julius Caesar. Brilliant, indebted, deeply charismatic, and utterly ruthless, Caesar conquered Gaul, expanding Rome's borders to the Rhine and the Atlantic, winning the absolute adoration of his legions. Alarmed by his growing power, the conservative Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome alone to face prosecution. Caesar faced an existential choice: surrender and face political execution, or cross the Rubicon River, the boundary of his province, with his armed legions, an act of explicit treason and civil war. In 49 BC, Caesar made his historic choice, uttering the immortal words, "The die is cast," and marched on Rome. What followed was a sweeping civil war that spanned the Mediterranean, pitting Caesar against his former friend and rival, Pompey the Great. Caesar emerged victorious, seizing absolute control of the state and having himself declared dictator in perpetuity. He reformed the calendar, stabilized the economy, and centralized governance. But Caesar's ambition had shattered the republican ideal. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, a cabal of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, cornered Caesar at the theater of Pompey and stabbed him 23 times, believing they were saving the Republic. They were devastatingly wrong. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Republic. It unleashed a fresh wave of catastrophic civil wars. Caesar's loyal general, Mark Antony, joined forces with Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian and Marcus Lepidus, to hunt down the assassins. Once the opposition was eliminated, the victors turned on each other. Antony retreated to the exotic east, falling under the spell of Cleopatra, the brilliant queen of Egypt. Octavian masterminded a brilliant propaganda campaign in Rome, painting Antony as a traitor who had sold out Roman values to a foreign seductress. The final showdown took place at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the tactical genius Agrippa, decisively defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Fleeing to Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra both died by suicide, leaving Octavian as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Republic was dead, buried beneath decades of civil war. But Octavian was too politically astute to repeat Caesar's mistake. He did not crown himself king, nor did he parade as a crude dictator. Instead, he maintained the illusion that the Republic had been restored, while quietly consolidating all executive, military, and religious power into his own hands. The Senate honored him with a new title, Augustus, the revered one. The Roman Empire was born. Augustus initiated the times Pax Romana, times 2 centuries of internal peace, stability, and unprecedented economic prosperity that stretched from the sands of Syria to the misty reign of Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Trade flourished along safe Roman roads guarded by the world's most disciplined standing army. Cities bloomed with marble temples, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and bathhouses. It was an era of breathtaking cultural output. Virgil writing the times, Aeneid, Livy chronicling history, and monumental engineering triumphs that pushed the limits of physics. Yet, the empire's stability depended entirely on the quality of the man sitting on the throne, and the imperial bloodline produced a wild, terrifying spectrum of human character. There were wise, philosophy-minded emperors like Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his profound times, Meditations times, while campaigning on the freezing Danubian frontier. But there were also monstrous tyrants who exposed the terrifying dangers of absolute power. Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri to indulge in dark paranoia. Caligula appointed his favorite horse to the priesthood and declared himself a living god before being cut down by his own bodyguards. Nero fiddled while Rome burned and unleashed unspeakable persecutions against a new, strange cult born in the provinces, Christianity. By the 3rd century AD, the cracks in the imperial colossus began to show. The empire had grown too large to defend. Borders were constantly breached by Germanic tribes, and the economy buckled under hyperinflation, plague, and skyrocketing military costs. A terrifying era known as the crisis of the 3rd century began, where, in the span of just 50 years, over 26 men seized the throne, almost all of them murdered by their own troops, in a relentless cycle of assassination and civil war. The empire was pulled back from the brink of total collapse by a series of iron-fisted soldier emperors. Diocletian restructured the administration, dividing the massive empire into a tetrarchy, sharing power across 4 rulers to make it manageable. Later, Constantine the Great reunited the empire, made Christianity a legal religion, and shifted the imperial capital away from pagan Rome to a brand new, glittering city on the Bosporus, Constantinople. Rome was no longer the political heart of its own empire. It was a museum city, a nostalgic ghost. The final act was agonizingly slow, drawn out over centuries. The empire was formally split into 2 halves: the Western Roman Empire, rotting from economic collapse, political corruption, and internal decay, and the Eastern Roman Empire, rich, secure, and culturally Greek, known to history as the Byzantine Empire. In the West, the borders gave way under the immense pressure of migrating Germanic tribes fleeing the ferocious Huns, sweeping out of the Asian steppes. Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths battered the frontiers. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric and the Visigoths breached the walls of Rome and sacked the Eternal City for the first time in 800 years. The psychological shockwaves reverberated across the ancient world. If Rome could fall, anything could fall. The final, pathetic end came in 476 AD, when a Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed a teenage puppet emperor named Romulus Augustulus. There was no grand battle, no cinematic last stand. The last emperor of Rome simply handed over the imperial insignia, and the Western Roman Empire quietly blinked out of existence. Yet, to view Rome's end as a total extinction is to misunderstand its true power. Rome never truly died. Its legal codes became the foundation of modern civil law across Europe and the Americas. Its language mutated into Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, while infusing English with thousands of root words. Its architectural genius, from the dome to the concrete arch, still stands proudly across skylines worldwide. Rome fell because it grew too vast, too corrupt, and too complacent to survive its own ambitions. But, in its rise and fall, it proved what human beings are capable of achieving when driven by an unshakable will to conquer the world, leaving behind an immortal footprint that echoes across the corridors of time.